So, welcome all of you. Thank you for being here in such a challenging day. Things are not easy in life, we already know that. Our theme today is a new mode of transcendence. We will begin with a brief introduction of each of our speakers on the theme. And then I will also make them some questions, but obviously we will leave room for you at the end of this talk. We are living in a material world, Madonna said some years ago. And historically, the transcendence, this separation from earth and heaven, just to be basic, has been rooted in spiritual and religious commitments. However, since the Enlightenment, things changed, and a future based on materialism was plausible, was something that was accepted enough and served as an alternative for transcendence. The nature of transcendence has shifted over the years. We have also Kuhneman saying that we passed from this horizontal transcendence with the authoritative God into a more horizontal transcendence, more based on human kindness, solidarity, bonds with others, caring for each one and another. And this has been also reflected on works, for instance, for Luis Irigaray or Luc Ferry and many others. They have observed also this shift in theology, not only in sociology. So religion has established a distinct and unique link, bond with earth and the heaven or the beyond. And this is the fundamental theme that we are going to talk about. Is transcendence still a valid category, or has been replaced, for instance, by global solidarity, human bonds that are perfectly acceptable and could give also meaning and sense for people, or not? At the end of your days, people is going to appeal to technology or to culture or to ecology, or at the end of their days, people will turn into something beyond. So the theme is not an easy one, it's a very challenging one. So I would now leave the floor for the first speaker, Professor Kohei Saito, then to Jose Casanova, and then to Professor Ungereanu. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So on Monday, I talked about climate change, and this is an example of how we are living in the material world. But today, I want to talk about this thesis that we might no longer be living in a material world because we are living in a digital world. And this poses a very difficult question in terms of hope, because I think we are almost losing the opportunity to transcend capitalism. I don't really have the teleological religious implication about transcendence. It's for me about transcendence is transcendence of capitalism. It's like socialist revolution. But the point is basically, so this is becoming really hard to imagine. And the hope, that's the topic of our global dialogue, is almost gone. So this is my second pessimistic turn that I'm sharing this time. So the whole point is, I think, Marxism always talk about this historical, more secular version of progress driven by this contradiction between forces of production and the relations of production and so on. And of course, many people criticize that the kind of teleology, economic determinism, and these are very problematic assumptions, and I agree. But today we have another problem. I think it's increasingly hard to imagine any kind of transcendence because we are completely sort of subsumed to the digital capital. And the world we are living is not the world of transcendence, but rather the world of immanence. So let me explain this a little bit. So I think one of the problems that we are witnessing about these gigantic tech companies, and people talk about surveillance, people talk about digital feudalism, and so on. And sometimes people compare this kind of surveillance state with the George Orwell's 1940s, 1984, that where all the informations, all the activities by us are under control, being watched, being controlled by that kind of the powerful government. But the situation today that we are now is a little bit different, because the world of 1984 is very dark, right? We are kind of like depressed world and so on. But today's world, we actually produce data with joy. We like things, we share things, and we post our photos, and with excitement. But then doing this, we produce data for the companies. And this is how the tech companies actually develop more sophisticated algorithms. And it's the way of not only extracting rent and subscription fees, but also adding more effective advertisement, charging fees, and so on and so on. And this is very difficult because the level of subsumption, what I mean, I will explain this concept soon, is becoming qualitatively different. Historically, this subsumption takes place by machines, and we sort of have this alienation, and we lose skill. We become more subjugated to the power of capital. This is a concept that Marx explains in Capital. That's the formal and the real subsumption. But what I want to propose is much deeper subsumption under the rule of capital, which I call total subsumption, because no longer the dominance of capital is taking place in the factory, but it's taking place everywhere, in the bedroom, in the workplace, of course, but in school, in places like here. We are always using those tech platforms and iPhones and other devices in order to be ourselves too. So we can no longer imagine a society without these things. And this tendency is even more accelerating today with AI. AI means that we are almost giving up our capacity to think, and think, of course, critically and creatively, because AI thinks for you. And that is posing a very difficult challenge for any project of transcendence. We are just so immanent to the world created by digital tech platforms as well as AI that we take them for granted. And we willingly produce that, we willingly ask in a way that AI can respond. So the way we think is being determined by AI, and that's same as our work is no longer determined by ourselves, but by machines. But that was the 19th century, but 21st century subsumption is going deeper and deeper. And there were some philosophers like Antonio Negri who said, but this kind of immanence is not necessarily a bad thing. We will have more democratic horizontal communication. That might lead to some kind of revolution of the multitude. But after 20 years from the publication of the Empire, I think the situation today is much more difficult. I think this is the world of complete subsumption, complete immanence to the domination of techno-capitalism.
Okay, good morning, everybody. To address the issue of whether we can imagine a new mode of transcendence, let me go a little further back. What do we mean by transcendence? Obviously, most theories of global development, human development, talk of at least three clear phases. One, the phase that was so well presented by Elena yesterday, cultures where there is no differentiation of nature and culture. This is what Durkheim, in the words of Durkheim, the elementary forms of religious life, all so-called primitive cultures from the most elementary to archaic societies were, in Durkheim's sense, monist, cosmic monist conceptions of the world. There was only one world. And in this world were the gods and nature and the cosmos and the ancestors and the animals, all and society, all parts of one single world. So humanity was simply part of a much larger world, but it was a monist, immanent world. There was no transcendence. There was no other world. Then is disputed, but comes the axial age, where transcendence emerges in global human history. But it emerges at least in 4 very different ways. The ancient Israeli prophets of a Yahweh, which is the creator of the universe and the really transcendence. Everything else created, but God is there, the transcendence. Is in Greek philosophy is the allegory of the cave of Plato, in which there's a higher reality. The world of ideas is a higher reality than the world of appearances here. It's a very different form of transcendence than the one of a theistic transcendence. The one of nirvana of Buddhism, again, very different, but it's also a higher form of life. It's a way of escaping the eternal rebirth, the wheel of rebirth towards nirvana and transcending it. Not transcend is the way Marxism transcends capitalism. This is not transcendence. This is simply within immanence, simply another form of another mode of production. Confucianism is more complex, whether we are dealing with transcendence or not, but a certain dualism emerges. But even today, we're still debating whether Confucianism really is a transcendental religion, whether the sacred is conceived as something transcendent or not. Probably is not clear. But then comes precisely with secular modernity. I mean, in Christianity, this transcendent conception, again, is dualism, but it's one that permeates the whole world. We understand nature in terms of God's creation. We understand society, the way in which it should be ordered. The secular world should be ordered according to higher principles. The economy should be a Christian economy. Politics should be a Christian politics, and so on. And then comes the modern world, the formation of the immanent frame, in which all parts of this immanent frame, the conception of the cosmos through science, is purely immanent. It is etsi deus non daretur, as if God would not exist. So you don't need the hypothesis of God to explain the universe, to explain how the economy works, to explain how our polity works. So everything can be explained without the hypothesis of God. Now, whether within this immanent frame, and this is of course the big question of Charles Taylor's work. I mean, if you read his work, the final part of his work is all how, I mean, he very clearly is autobiographical. His thirst for transcendence, that is called in the words of Christian Orthodox theology, divinization of humanity, that we become divine, that humans really attain a higher form of being than just simply being human, somehow partake of divinity. Within etsi deus non daretur, individuals can believe whatever they want. There is possibility of people believing in transcendence. So the notion that within our modern world, people don't believe anymore, this maybe in Europe we can accept, but for the rest of the world, this is nonsense. The question whether, for instance, the whole debate, Bella Eisenstadt, whether Japan was an axial society or whether Japanese society remained an archaic society that incorporated Confucianism and Buddhism, which clearly were transcendental, and yet Japan somehow remained. I don't believe this theory, but anyhow, these are the kind of debates that you have. So the question is, which kind of new transcendence could we have? A transcendence in the sense in which the whole universe can be understood as part of a larger principle. This we cannot reconstruct. But certainly, the possibility, we as a global humanity, to recover all these phases so that we once again resacralize nature for the sake of avoiding the ecological disaster. If you look Habermas, in his Kantian conception, you cannot have an intersubjective relation with nature. This is metaphysics. Well, unless we, as humans, develop an intersubjective relation with nature. Not only this our life world, but that really to transcend the Anthropocene, we need once again to view ourselves not as the kings of the universe, but precisely as simply part of a much larger whole, cosmic, the earth, Gaia, and the life world, and everything else. And this, of course, the critique of our instrumental reason. Read Mama Lola, about this Haitian voodoo priest that precisely developed a critique similar to the one of the Frankfurt School on instrumental reason, both Christian and secular. But so how can we, a way in which we recover all these phases of development of humanity so that we can, again, all the cultures of humanity develop some kind of ecumenical understanding of us as humans, detains all this past, not as something we've overcome and repressed, but something that really helps us being human in a way in which AI is not. We are ultimately mammals, and we only become human because we are mammals. The notion that we can become rational machines, this is, of course, the dream of Descartes, to be born as an adult person, not to go through this stupidity of childhood and fairy tales and myths and rituals and so on. Well, we are humans, we are mammals. We cannot transcend our mammality. I mean, if you want to transcend it through machines, go ahead. Yeah, I understand what I'm saying in general.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Really great days. So I wrote some lines down. So the ecological crisis, the rise of artificial intelligence, the erosion of democracy, and various forms of resistance are reshaping how we live and imagine transcendence, what exceeds grounds and gives meaning to our finite existence. On the one hand, we witness what might be called pathological forms of transcendence. I want to distinguish between pathological forms of transcendence and positive forms of transcendence that can be inspiring, and you already alluded to one. So the first pathological form of transcendence that is raging nowadays appears in the current marriage of religion and authoritarianism of the extreme right, an unholy alliance visible from the US and India to Russia and my country of origin, the Orthodox Romania. Here, an otherworldly transcendence becomes a weapon of exclusion, a banner of national identity, and a justification for gender and racial domination. God basically is hijacked by the extreme right, and sometimes, as it happens in my country, in the name of the Global South and the struggle of the Global South against Western colonialism. A second pathological form arises from the secular side, transhumanism. Deeply influential in Silicon Valley, this movement dreams of overcoming the human condition through technology by merging consciousness with machines, pursuing immortality or transcending the organic. Suffering and death from this perspective are treated as mere technical problems to be solved, essentially a process similar to fixing a broken car or a broken fridge. Paradoxically, this vision fusing technology and eschatology represents a kind of positive religion, to use Comte's older phrase, a longing for imminent transcendence, stripped of humility, empathy, and community. Go back, for instance, to the 98 Manifesto of Transhumanism by Nick Bostrom. There is a corollary to this story. In his recent lectures on the Antichrist, Peter Thiel, the founder of PayPal and so one of the most influential tech bros, frames progressive voices as facets of the Antichrist, well-meaning do-gooders who can only bring about destruction and chaos. Now, it is no wonder that this vision of a false Messiah or false transcendent echoes certain Orthodox theologies, such as that of Vladimir Solovyov. I'm thinking of his last writing, which is a brilliant writing that ends with the tale of the Antichrist that echoes Dostoevsky, the Grand Inquisitor, one of actually Putin's favorite authors and very popular in my home country. Yet alongside these pathologies, we find other forms of transcendence. As Charles Taylor, that you mentioned, suggested with his notion of the immanent frame, modernity has not abolished transcendence, it has reconfigured it. First, we can point to the spiritual ecological movement exemplified by Pope Francis Laudato Si. In his exemplary universalism of the center, Rome is a center. Transcendence becomes a deepening of our sense of belonging to the world, the creation as a gift of God, an invitation to solidarity with all creatures and with the earth itself. From this perspective, I quote, "We have to realize that a true ecological approach always becomes a social approach. It must integrate questions of justice into debates on the environment so as to hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor." Second, there has been a growing revalorization of indigenous cosmovisions, and we are asked to speak briefly about it. We spoke yesterday about it. You mentioned them in passing. Such tradition, long marginalized, offer profound relational cosmology, and the sacred and the natural, the human and non-human are intertwined. They articulate a mode of transcendence within immanence. Obviously, this is a language that is not developed within these languages, but I think that analytically you can use it, that challenges Western subject-object metaphysics and underpins an ethics of interconnection, then is crucial, I think, for our planetary future. As the Maori saying has it, "I'm the river is me." This saying associated with the Waganoi River in the New Zealand should be taken literally, not as a form of new age, wishy-washy, tree-hugging spirituality or a mere poetic metaphor. It also expresses a sort of vision, a non-anthropocentric vision of unity and solidarity that goes beyond or expands this unit of intellect that very nicely was mentioned in the first day by invoking the great figure of Ibn Rushd. The desirable implication from my perspective of these very short reflections is not, I think, to aspire to the reconstitution of the social ecological bonds on account either of a lateral universalism and civil war against the center, or of a celebratory de-Americanization discourse glossing over what remains and is modelic, universal, and inspiring in the US tradition. Rosa Parks, Ruth Ginsburg, Spike Lee, Bernie Sanders as American as apple pie, or by whitewashing China's neo-authoritarian regime. Rather, from my perspective, is to imagine a plural archipelago of relative centers in dynamic relation of non-domination to their peripheries, where types of property and economic material practices coexist, and where dynamics of extraction, I think unavoidable in large complex society, for instance, to make those solar panels that were invoked yesterday, or the phones for the Africans, are limited by eco-philosophy and similar other types of thinking and movements. So perhaps one of the questions today is what kind of transcendence we are willing to imagine, experience, and cultivate. Will it be one of domination and escapism? There is actually an eco-philosophical romanticized version of that, just as there is a radical communist one from my perspective of Zizek and Agamben, or one of relation, pluralistic arrangement, humility, and care.
Thanks a lot for this excellent and robust framework. We're going to ask Transcendence few things. The first one, is the idea of transcendence guilty of not having done sufficient effort to make this world a better one? The idea of the beyond, the idea of the heaven, is guilty of not having done this effort here on earth? Jose, perhaps you could start.
I think that this is, of course, the critique of the Enlightenment against supernaturalism, right? That religion is an escape that precisely does not allow us to get involved, committed towards happiness here on earth. So the notion of, so well expressed, not only liberty, equality, and fraternity, but liberty and the pursuit of happiness. So the pursuit of happiness here on earth becomes a fundamental value of modernity. And in this respect, it's a critique of any type of otherworldly conception in which happiness will only emerge, let's say, in the afterlife. So yes, I think that this is, and I think that contemporary religions, all of them, have already incorporated this critique. You cannot say of the Catholic Church today that only, let's say, preaches heaven and heaven. No, it still preaches the kingdom of God. But always in history, and you see, I mean, certainly the social doctrine of the church is all about transforming social structures, bringing social justice, bringing equality, bringing fraternity, solidarity. So it's all about it. So in this respect, religions have been transformed by the modern critique of religion. So if you can say that with let's say, with Charles Taylor, that basically these values of modernity are secularized notions of Christianity, then certainly Christianity has been also secularized then internally by becoming modern.
So the Enlightenment was a needed moment for this purification of the idea of transcendence, but it has made religions and spirituality better or not? Camille, can you say something on that?
I don't think that the idea of the transcendence per se, if transcendence is an idea at all, is guilty of anything per se. It's what we humans do with it and how we relate to it and how experience and how we shape around our practices around an idea of transcendence or another. So nowadays you see, as I was actually alluded to, you see positive developments, and we need all these developments in order to counteract imaginatively authoritarianism that is rampant and is growing everywhere, but also positive understandings of transcendence. Concerning the question of the Enlightenment, that's a very, it's a very tricky question because there are different types of Enlightenment. Some of them are hostile to religion, some of them are not. Furthermore, Enlightenment has an extremely complex understanding with religion. Let me give you an example of Marx, for instance, that you mentioned, and then you'll correct me for sure because you are the expert in Marxism and so on. Marx is a radical Enlightenment thinker, but I think rightly his conception was interpreted and reduced. That was unjust. It was interpreted as a political religion, and indeed it acted in the 20th century as a political religion, that is, as a transformation of the eschaton. Of the immanentization of the eschaton, providing a sort of a paradise on earth that is a transcendence that is immanent with disastrous consequences, right? I'm not trying to reduce Marxism to, well, not to that, but it definitely, the case of Marxism points to a very complex relationship, not only of exclusion and good transformation, let's say, speaking of purification, whatever that means, but with some disastrous, let's say, entanglements there that are extremely complex.
Thanks a lot. I'm turning into another question. Is it a nonsense to talk today about salvation? This is a part of transcendence in a world that does not need to be saved or does not think that salvation is an issue? Saito?
So there was this political consequences that Marxism encountered in the 20th century. Because basically, Marx started with this, revision is the opium of masses, this radical critique of religion, ended up replacing Christianity with another kind of political theology and political disaster as a consequence. And that is how historically even progressive people do not talk about, transcendence of capitalism in recent years. I mean, it's changing with Mamdani and so on, but I'm not sure he's talking about transcendence of capitalism, right? So we are still happy with him. So that's how deflated now the concept of socialism is today. But the point is, this idea of salvation is here in deep crisis. But there's a very much negative side. I think the concept of transcendence, emancipation, is often associated with some kind of infinity. But as Jose just pointed out, we are animals. We are bodily existence. Our life is thus unescapably finite. And so maybe Marx is not really about transcendence. It's more about materialist thinker focusing on this finiteness and vulnerability because we are bodily existence. And that's material. Materialism is about this vulnerability. And that opens up, I would say, like a different conception of freedom that might be still useful based on Marx's ideas, which is that not the transcendence as the condition or the condition of freedom, but finiteness, the immanence to this material world of our bodily existence is actually the condition of freedom. If you live forever, you don't really care what you do today, next 10 years or in 100 years, because you can always do later. So you don't have to choose, and everything becomes basically meaningless. You don't have to prioritize things. But since your life is finite because of your finite, vulnerable bodily existence, you are compelled to choose what's more important for your life. And we cannot do everything in our life. And we always make mistakes because we are finite. But for Marx or for materialists, I think this kind of freedom is very important. We cannot do everything, but that is why we are free. We can choose what we want to do. And that's how we actually establish or create our own identity. I cannot be good father and good writer at the same time because I spend more time writing. I sacrifice my time with children. So this is a finiteness. But this is a freedom that I can choose. And through this choice, I become what I want to be or what I am. So maybe that kind of freedom, the Marxist materialist conception of freedom, may not be necessarily associated with kind of salvation, emancipation, and transcendence. So this is good for this deflated age of socialism. People get scared of talking about revolutions.
If I may add something, obviously this is the whole issue. I mean, in the sociology of religion, Max Weber has to do everything with salvation religions, right? He's totally uninterested in the religions prior to salvation, and he thinks that these salvation religions have no future. So we know that even in the Bible, what does God promises Abraham if he is faithful? Well, you are going to have many, many wives, and therefore as many children as stars in heaven, and you are going to live, let's say, 800 years, and you are going to have thousands of sheep, and this is what God promises Abraham, right? For being just. And this is what all pre-axial religions promise. There comes a time that injustice in this world is such that people say, no, obviously the people that are doing well are not being rewarded, and the evil people are being rewarded in this earth. So something must be done. And this is where the need to transcend the type of a structure that rewards evil people and doesn't reward good people emerges. And this is basically. So, but then it emerges from what you want to be safe and for what. Obviously, Israeli concept of salvation is a collective one. It's a messianic one for the people of Israel, not individual. With Christianity, it's more individual salvation. With Buddhism, is also individual salvation. Israel. So again, the fundamental question is then, what do we need to be safe from and for what? And of course, what do we need to be safe from today? From catastrophe. From catastrophe in every sense. Humanity is on the cusp of a precipice, and we need to be safe from it. And so how can we transcend this world, this way of doing things. So in this respect, we are in a similar situation as the dissenters and protesters and, and visionaries of the axial age. They try to look for a higher form of life. Here, we are not looking for a higher form. We are trying to save life itself, for everybody, with solidarity, and not only for humans, but to save nature and to save all animals, the whole creation. So this is basically what salvation would mean today. Let's say working for salvation today means precisely contributing to make sure that life doesn't really end in this way, that this is not the end of life, death, right? So any notion of transcendence has to be somehow based on this conception that we are on the cusp of a collective catastrophe that is irreversible.
So prior to the collapse, we have this idea of interconnectedness and this idea of solidarity as a possible path, as a new mode of transcendence. This is the name of our panel. Do you agree with that? Solidarity and interconnectedness could be the new name of transcendence?
Well, to go back to the question of salvationism, I think is on the rise, both the offer and the demand. And to add to what you're saying, and then to go back to the question of solidarity. So the tech brothers, they want to save us. It's pretty obvious. There is an offer either by going through Mars or by overcoming death, overcoming our mammal condition, right? We are dependent on that when you need independence. That's freedom from that perspective, right? So that's a vision of salvation. So that's why I was speaking about this positive religion, this fusion between salvationism, if you will, and technology, right? And this appeals to many. And obviously, transhumanism, I mean, is not only a vision, we're mammals indeed, but we are mammals endowed with an extraordinary imagination. But it's also a reality. So we don't know exactly how we're going to cope with it, right? There is a great demand for, on the other hand, in our societies, the way I perceive it. And this is because not simply material insecurities that are pretty much everywhere, with the growing gap between rich and poor and so on and so forth. It's a global phenomenon. But with another phenomenon that is associated with it, and it is related to meaninglessness, is related to what can be called existential insecurity. So there is a demand for salvationist discourses. We want to get out of that. You see that in various countries that actually religion and religious offers, sometimes in conjunction, unfortunately, to authoritarianism, offer some sort of salvation from existential insecurity, from this sense, if you will, of catastrophe. Now, going back to solidarity, I mean, it really depends how you articulate philosophically solidarity, right? If you link it or not to the question of transcendence. To connect with the debate in the first day, for instance, Marina, who is there, was referring to a vision of solidarity based on reciprocity. That's not a vision based on transcendence, let's say. From my perspective, I think that you should think of a variety of types of solidarity, interconnectedness. There is a plurality of types of solidarity and interconnectedness, and we should cherish all that plurality in order to counteract somehow, this insecurity, existential security, the sense of catastrophe, and all the troubles of that are pending. To give you an example, one is based on reciprocity, right? But other forms of solidarity are not necessarily based on reciprocity, but are based on non-reciprocity, right? On a form of caritas. I know that Marina, to apologize to mention your name again, was opposing caritas and charity and solidarity, but not necessarily opposed. Depends what type of charity, right? So here we have different types already of solidarity. For instance, one that is based on charity can be connected to the notion of transcendence. This can be it can be fruitful. The idea is that we have different resources around the globe, different religious tradition, this is spiritual tradition, different economic tradition, for instance, of commoning and so on, that can foster practices of solidarity related to transcendence or not, that can be useful, it can draw on nowadays.
If I may add, almsgiving is a central virtue of Islam, right? Muslim religion. And actually in the latest letter of the Pope, he says the habitus that almsgiving gives is very important. Because otherwise we think that solidarity means somehow only collective or... So the notion to see solidarity, yes, also in helping each and every person that is in need, is very important. Not only solidarity is a collective goal or something, so it's very important. It builds a habitus, and you see the other is different. It's a brother and a sister when you do this almsgiving as a ritual that is part of your religious habitus. So we as secular people should not undermine the importance of this habitus.
Thank you for bringing it into the conversation. I would like very much to know also how, which kind of transcendence the artificial intelligence could also bring. But since time is here, we will open the floor. We will open the floor for our guests. So please, here. Do you? Okay.
Thank you for the fascinating panel. I'm particularly interested in this panel because I think our intellectual salvation, is somewhere between the thin line, on the thin line between material thinking, Marx, or Enlightenment, and religion. It's the thin line of poetry that is shared by the both worlds. Marx expert, my dear friend Kohei, just repeated from Marx that he said, religion is opium of the societies. Everybody loves that part of that sentence, but that sentence continues, actually. I know it because it's the subtitle of my book. It's the heart for the heartless world, sigh of the oppressed, soul for the soulless world. So when you look at Marx or any Enlightenment, giant, Marina was talking about it actually beautifully. We think of the crystallized images of these guys, which is a little bit unpleasant, to be honest. I hear in the other words, the remaining of that sentence, he's giving it to religion. He's kind of aspiring to that idea, to that poetry of religion. This is one side. And the other side, liberation theology in Latin America or similar experiences that were violently oppressed in Muslim world, in North Africa, in Middle East. There's politics coming together with the men of God or women of God. They are still our salvation. Them being oppressed or suppressed or silenced do not mean that they were wrong. I think our intellectual salvation is somewhere there on that thin line of poetry. And I think our intellectual discourse has to make that poetic leap. We should be courageous enough to walk on that thin line. And having said this, yesterday I gave this talk to young people, and I learned that those videos of those panels for 16-year-olds were actually watched by adults because they think, they are embarrassed to say that they don't understand these panels, so they go and watch the videos of those panels organized for 16-year-olds. This is to say, all these concepts, transcendence and so on, this is just an idea, a proposal perhaps. Maybe we should find a more compassionate, more generous terms for these things. And I was thinking about solidarity and horizontal transcendence, which is a beautiful concept, I don't know. maybe we should, define solidarity, especially today, as staying with in suffering, staying with in pain, not standing together against, but just staying with. And that perhaps is horizontal, or maybe, I don't know if I'm sure there's a chic term for this, like, going down together and staying there for a bit to rise up again. So maybe we should replace these big concepts with smaller concepts, or more compassionate concepts, so we can build that togetherness and walk on that thin poetic line together towards of a salvation of some sort. This is not a question, obviously. This was just a comment, and thank you for all the fascinating inputs.
But it's a great comment, if I may add. Actually, there are such concepts. I mean, the Jesuits are, and I'm pointing to Padre Spadaro, they are artists in doing that, to find God in all things, to accompany. The Jesuit Refugee Services accompanies the refugees. Doesn't save them, yes, accompanies them, to accompany. Those are the kind of things in which precisely this is also the language of transcendence. If you do everything for the glory of God, this means, you do the same things, but if you see God in all things and you accompany others, it's the major form of love your neighbor. Then obviously this is forms of doing transcendence. As to liberation theology, there is no doubt that this is today the truly global theology. Not because they have copied the words of Latin American liberation, but because they have copied the method. Doing theology from your particular concrete space identity. So you have womanist theology, feminist liberation theology, black women theology, Jewish liberation theology, Muslim liberation theology, Korean liberation theology. So you find liberation theologies all over the world, not because they copy the words of Gustavo Gutierrez, but because they copy the method of doing theology from your particular point of view.
Thinking about transcendence in relation to the future as something that does not happen in the present has to do with the cultural notion of time. It's possible to think about transcendence, to reframe it in cultural or linguistic frameworks, does not think of time as something linear, as something in progression. What about the transcendence in relation with cultural differences in ways of thinking about time? And what about the differences between reciprocity instead of solidarity?
If I may, obviously this is where we understand that there are different anthropologies and different cosmovisions which are related precisely to these notions, right? Any notion of eternal birth and rebirth, any notion of transmigration of souls, not that the soul is born only once, but never dies. So the Jesuits tried to argue with Buddhists and Hindus and couldn't convince them, because they were arguing, and they were not arguing from a theological point of view, they were arguing from the point of view of Greek anthropology. And I said, well, this is our anthropology. So again, this is where we as humans must understand that our conceptions of the person are different, our conceptions of time are different cultures, and we have to somehow be in dialogue, in communication with all of them if we want to build this kind of precisely solidarity.
Thank you. I would like to build on both of the previous two comments. I think that we are faced with two aspects of finiteness in life. There is a kind of material finiteness, and there is a finiteness of time. And our various belief systems try to grapple with how to deal with these two aspects of finiteness. The fact that we experience life in this form for a finite period of time, and the fact that there's a limited amount of stuff or money available. And we then enter into a kind of dance as to which of these finitenesses will we focus on, how do we focus on them? And we often imagine, in a sense, that there's a tension between these two things. I can either maximize wealth or I can maximize my own comfort with mortality through a sort of spiritual or other tradition. And I would love to get your reactions to this, because I think what both of the previous two speakers were touching on this, if I understand correctly. I think that the necessity of grappling with the finiteness of time, with mortality, even if we imagine a permanent soul, even if we imagine rebirth, even our lived experience of death being something that we encounter, and a certain degree of uncertainty about what happens thereafter and before. This creates in us a potential to find ways to try to transcend our horror and fear of this predicament. And in a sense, there's an empathetic possibility that comes as our reaction to this. And that empathetic possibility is we can empathize with the universe, we can empathize with nature, we can empathize with our fellow human beings. And that out of this can be born a kind of empathetic transcendence, which has many different names and many different cultures, but you see in all cultures, I think. And in fact, that empathy itself can then be the basis for gestures that we make to try to transcend the limitations of the material world. In other words, our recognition that a kind of transcendence of mortality is required in every culture gives birth to an impulse which has within it the possibility to try to mitigate the material limitations of all people and life around us. And so I think that these two questions of in a sense, material transcendence, or the transcendence of material limitation, and the attempt to transcend mortality in some way, or at least our fear of mortality, can in fact work collaboratively. But what we see instead happening very often is we deploy them against each other. We try to weaponize our fear of mortality against a kind of empathetic feeling. And we similarly focus on a fetishization of transcending material constraint and use that to weaponize against each other. But I'd just be very curious from the panel or from anybody in the room as to do you think that assuming that you agree or that you're willing to entertain the idea that there are these two constraints, and that at least one of them we must try to transcend just as beings, which is this notion of death. Do we have a possibility to sort of, in a way, unite these two? Is there some underlying impulse that we can tap into? And how do we, if we think that that is a possibility, how do we facilitate and bring that about?
It's a very tough question, but I think it's very profound. I agree fully with you. And there are different versions of addressing this. I mean, the fear of death and overcoming the fear of death means that some believe that death is not somehow the end, right? Doesn't say that there is another life. So death does not triumph, right? A promise that death does not triumph. What does it mean? Again, you have Walter Benjamin in his messianic conception. How can you somehow save those who were condemned by history? How can, even if we build the kingdom of God on earth, even if it will be possible to think eschatologically that the eschaton can be realized here, it wouldn't do anything for all these victims of history. So this fundamental question, that is not enough to project our precisely transcendence of these limitations for our own future or the future. That's something we have to incorporate all of humanity and the cosmos into it. And it's the messianic conception of creating the world anew, a new creation, right? This is what precisely, it's not only my own transcendence in life, but the notion that somehow this is what the kingdom of God means, a new creation, and things will be made anew. And these were the prophets' promises, and so. I mean, we can put it in Buddhist terms, we can put it in Confucian terms, Taoist terms. There are all these messianic, eschatological conceptions. Can be the new world is going to be reborn, which is the one that is going to be bring. But anyhow, so you give us the Japanese vision.
I'm very Eurocentric thinker, actually. People often
You
read
are-
my book, or
you
this
are
is like a new
Eurocentric.
interpretation of Marx from Japan, and I'm like, very
Yeah,
traditional
indeed.
German Marxist. But anyway, maybe what I wanted to say is that there's a pathological reaction to this finiteness, and transhumanism is obviously the one. And also capitalism is also this negation of finiteness. Capital as this infinite process of valorification of value is irrational based on this finiteness of our world. So my kind of degrowth turn is basically accepting finiteness, accepting limit, is not the negation of our freedom. Rather, it is a condition of possibility of freedom, because if you are really infinite, there is no freedom, right? And in capitalism, there is no freedom either, because even if no matter how much technology is developed, these technology will be utilized to produce more, to extract more values. So never shorter working hours, no increase of free time. And I think only accepting this kind of finiteness, we can enjoy our life, we can spend our finite life for better purposes.
I see the horizon over there, but I have 1 minute left. So we are in the middle of this challenge. We have one question here and one question here, and we stop. So very, very, very brief. Thank you very much.
Okay. Hola, hola. So first, thank you, all of you, for this talk. And I wanted to bring out maybe another kind of approach, or maybe see, first of all, and come back to what Jose said about the rational thinkers we are, or the implication of Descartes, because I think we are not realizing what we are saying when we are saying cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I exist. And the problem is that all we do is understand through thoughts. And the moment we do that, we understand only from thoughts. And we completely abandon and say that thoughts as a method, as a theory, as those parts of words and then the interconnectedness of those words will unveil the reality as it is. But as we do so, we completely abandon experience, and we understand nature as a machine and our bodies as a machine. And the moment we do this, we forget experience. And all we're talking about only comes back to experience and what experience even involves. And it involves obviously the material side and the mental side, but they are just poles of experience. All we have is experience. Outside of experience, there's nothing, nothing, nothing. And what I'm trying to say is that thoughts, even more importantly, are motivated and are just explicit manifestations of, of pre-established meanings, of pre-assumptions. And we are living in all of this society, the economical way of doing is just established on big pre-assumptions. And we aren't aware of those. We think that we understand reality with thoughts. See, one moment. But the thing is that we have the presumption of a couple ones, but let me just state quickly the most important ones.
We don't have time.
See, I know, but I will do it really quick. First one is human is egoistic, by Hobbes, of course. Then we have property is happiness, is holy, is sacred. And all solutions we are going to come by having thoughts and saying how things are isn't going to work.
I need to cut you.
Yes, of course, cut me.
I thank you very
Thank
much,
you
but I
very
need to
much.
cut you. And just to jump from here to here and to close, because I don't want to be rude, but we have another panel waiting. So thank you very much.
Just very quickly, to shift the framework a bit, is instead of eschatological thinking, to maybe think from the position of abundance. Because the material world, the natural world, is a planet full of abundance. And if we care for it, and if we submit to our dependence on it and our own natural, natures, then the world could look quite differently. I think part of what keeps us in this trap of the crisis of modernity is the constant thinking of eschatological thinking. So I just wanted to throw that out there. And a reference is Robin Val Kimmerer's work. She is a biologist, an indigenous biologist of North America, who has written several books on abundance economy.
Hello? Yeah. No, it's a radical gear shift because the name of Habermas was mentioned twice, I think, and was mentioned yesterday too. I must confess to a personal perplexity here, which is that 2 years ago, Habermas endorsed Israel's war on Gaza. He has not said anything since. Perhaps, in retrospect, his endorsement would be seen as much of an intellectual calamity or crime as Heidegger's support for the Nazi regime. Maybe not, maybe not. In one sense, at least, Heidegger's thinking was not damaged by his endorsement of the Nazi early endorsement, which he withdrew. But I think there is something about Habermasian notions of communicative rationality, which are certainly challenged, arguably, by his endorsement of what turns out to be a genocide. So just in the way this political calamity has made us very aware of the fragility of our political institutions in advanced democracies, I wonder what questions it poses for this philosophical tradition stemming from the secular Enlightenment, of which Habermas is the last great exponent.
I use the name of Habermas critically because his Kantianism cannot go beyond the radical separation of the critique of pure reason, the critique of practical reason, and aesthetic judgment. And within these categories, you cannot address issues of the meaning of the universe and the meaning of Gaia, the meaning of those things and how we are part of. So I fully agree. As to the other thing, I am enough of a friend of Habermas that I wouldn't put it in the category of Heidegger, certainly. It may be a mistake as a public statement, it has to be understood as a public statement within Germany, and the guilt that he feels, having been brought into the army at the very end when he was 15 years old, and being a Nazi soldier, and then finding out about the Holocaust afterwards, and you can understand anything of Habermas, and you understand he carries this guilt with him personally, and he cannot overcome this guilt.
Can I say a word in favor of Habermas?
A word. A word.
I don't think it can deduce from his conception this calamitous. I don't think it can deduce from his position.
It's working. It's working. It's working. It's working.
Oh, it's working. It's working. I don't think there is any way for Mr. From limits of his ecological view can deduce this calamitous position and then, trash the whole critical theory tradition. Actually, there was a split, a very unfortunate one, among critical theorists. So Habermas, Forst, and others who actually wrote that letter and signed that letter is very unfortunate. I think there's a lot of complexity there. So it might be that this Germanness and his early trauma, I'm not trying to justify it, but maybe to explain what seems to be unexplainable, played actually a role, right? So his effective, let's say, trajectory, right? So.
And as to the fact he has not spoken, he has become old. Thank you. He become old enough that he has no more words.
Thanks a lot. I mean, it's a passionate debate, but we need to get it. Thanks a lot.